I woke up to the sound of chainsaws tearing through my backyard. By the time I ran outside, half of my 180-year-old oak tree was already on the ground, cut down by HOA so their friends could get a better lake view. They thought I was just some quiet widower who would take the fine, clean up the mess, and move on. But what they didn't know was that tree wasn't just mine. It was protected by the state, and every cut they made turned their little HOA power trip into a legal disaster. Subscribe, because this is the story of how they tried to steal my view and ended up losing everything. The boy was standing at the edge of my driveway with a bicycle on its side beside him, both hands clenched around the straps of his backpack, staring at the old oak tree like he expected it to apologize for something. Behind him, a white SUV idled in the morning fog, its headlights cutting through the mist off Lake Alder, and a woman in a cream blazer was photographing my front yard like it was a crime scene. Nobody spoke for a moment. Even the crows in the branches went quiet. That was my first warning that peace was not included in the purchase price. My name is Ethan Walker, 54 years old, 6 months retired from the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and 3 months a widower, though some mornings that word still felt too large to carry. I had bought the cabin at Lake Alder because it looked like the kind of place grief might eventually get tired of following me. Weathered cedar siding, a stone chimney blackened from decades of winter fires, a porch that sagged just enough to feel honest, and beyond it, a narrow blue slice of lake shining between the trees. It wasn't a rich man's lake house. It was an old man's promise to himself that if he kept breathing long enough, the world might become quiet again. The first thing my wife Claire had loved about the place was not the lake, it was the tree. An Oregon white oak stood 20 feet from the porch, massive and crooked, and alive in a way houses never are. Its trunk was wider than my kitchen table, furrowed with dark bark that looked almost burned in the rain, and its limbs reached over the yard like the ribs of some ancient cathedral. In the afternoon, the leaves broke the sunlight into gold pieces across the porch boards. In the evening, they caught the lake wind before it reached the windows. The tree blocked part of the view, sure, but Claire had stood under it the first time we toured the property and placed her hand against the bark like she was greeting someone older than both of us. "Every house has a lake view," she had said. "Not every house has a witness." That sentence stayed with me longer than most prayers. So when I moved in, I did what people do when they are trying to survive the shape of an empty house. I fixed things. I replaced the rusted mailbox. I cleared moss from the roof. I stacked firewood until my shoulders hurt enough to sleep. I unpacked Claire's books, but not her sweaters. And every morning before coffee, I stepped onto the porch and looked at that oak, because it was the only thing on the property that seemed to understand how to stand still without falling apart. The woman in the cream blazer did not look like someone who believed in standing still. She looked polished in a way that felt aggressive. Silver blonde hair cut sharp at her jaw, pearl earrings, white slacks too clean for a gravel road, and a leather folder tucked against her ribs like a weapon she had practiced drawing. The boy beside the bicycle looked about 12, small for his age, dark-haired with one shoelace untied and a red mark across one cheek that might have been from sleep or crying. When the woman finished photographing my tree, she turned the camera toward him. "Milo," she said, not loudly but with the kind of voice that makes children shrink. "Pick up that bike. Your mother already has enough violations." The boy bent so fast it looked rehearsed. I stepped off the porch before I meant to. The boards creaked under my boots, and the woman's eyes came to me immediately, measuring, categorizing, filing me into whatever drawer she kept for people who disappointed her. I was in an old flannel shirt, jeans with sawdust on the knees, and a gray beard I had stopped trimming carefully after Claire got sick. I must have looked exactly like what she expected, a quiet man recently arrived, easy to pressure. She smiled, not a warm smile, a meeting smile, a smile with paperwork behind it. "Mr. Walker," she said, walking toward me without waiting to be invited. "Marjorie Blake, president of the Cedarview Estates Homeowners Association. I wanted to welcome you personally and clear up a small landscaping issue before it becomes unpleasant. The lake wind moved through the oak above us, and a handful of leaves drifted down between us like slow, deliberate warnings. I looked past her to the road. Cedarview Estates began about 200 yards uphill, a clean row of pale houses with black roofs and wide windows angled toward the water. My cabin sat below them on a separate parcel, older than the subdivision, older than its paved sidewalks and matching mailboxes and decorative stone entrance sign. I knew that because I had read the deed twice before signing. After 30 years in environmental permitting, I did not trust cheerful brochures, handshake promises, or people who used the word community when they meant control. Marjorie opened her folder and slid out a single page printed on thick paper. At the top, in green letters, it read, "Friendly Compliance Reminder." She held it out to me as if she were offering a dinner invitation. I did not take it. Her smile tightened, but only at the corners. "The oak tree on your front lawn is obstructing the Lakeview corridor for lots 18 through 24, she said. It also creates a shadow imbalance across the shared visual landscape. We're asking you to remove it within 30 days, or at minimum, reduce the canopy by 60%. For a second, I heard Claire's voice instead of hers. Not every house has a witness. The boy, Milo, had stopped pretending to adjust his bike chain. He was watching me now, eyes wide and worried, like my answer might somehow affect his own punishment. That was when I noticed a woman standing halfway behind the open door of the white SUV. She was maybe late 30s, with tired eyes, a grocery store cardigan, and the tense posture of someone who had learned to stay near exits. She gave me the smallest shake of her head. "Not now," it said. "Be careful." I looked back at Marjorie. "My property isn't part of Cedarview Estates." Her smile returned too quickly. "Technically, no. Legally, no." That landed. Only for half a second, but it landed. The fog was lifting off the lake now, revealing silver water between the oak branches. Up on the hill, the houses of Cedarview Estates were waking behind their giant windows, the people inside probably drinking coffee and looking down at my tree like it had personally insulted their mortgages. Marjorie stepped closer. I could smell expensive perfume over wet leaves. "Mr. Walker," she said softly, "you see our lake, you use our road, and your property affects our values. That means you respect our standards." There it was. Not a request, not a misunderstanding, a claim. I finally took the paper from her, folded it once, and slid it into the back pocket of my jeans. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I had spent most of my adult life watching people destroy themselves because they mistook calm for weakness. Marjorie Blake looked like she had made that mistake before, and been rewarded for it. "I'll review it," I said. She seemed pleased by that, which told me she had heard surrender where I had meant documentation. She gave the oak one last glance, not the way a person looks at a tree, but the way a contractor looks at an obstacle. Then she turned to the boy. "Milo, bike, now." The woman by the SUV flinched at the sharpness of it. Milo lifted the bicycle with both hands and guided it toward the car without looking up. As Marjorie walked away, her heels pressed small, dark marks into the damp gravel of my driveway, and I watched them fill slowly with water. That evening, just after sunset, there was a soft knock on my back door. Not the front door, the back. When I opened it, the woman from the SUV stood on the steps with Milo behind her, half hidden in the dark, clutching a sketchbook to his chest. Her face looked different without Marjorie beside it. Still afraid, but not weak. Afraid the way people are when they have already lost something and know exactly what the next loss will cost. "I'm Lena Ortiz," she whispered. "I live in Cedarview." I waited. She looked over her shoulder toward the hill, where the HOA houses glowed in neat rows above the lake. Then she turned back to me and said the sentence that changed the sound of the whole night. "Mr. Walker, if Marjorie wants that tree gone, she won't stop at a letter." By sunrise, someone had taped a red envelope to my front door with a strip of black electrical tape, right at eye level, like a warning in a crime scene photograph. The paper inside was still damp from the lake fog, but the number printed at the bottom was perfectly clear. $500. Above it, in bold capital letters, Cedar View Estates accused me of failing to comply with approved lakefront visual standards, as if my old oak had committed an offense by standing where God and time had put it. I stood there, barefoot, on the cold porch boards, the envelope in one hand, coffee forgotten in the other, and looked across the yard at the tree. Morning light moved through its branches in slow gold strips. A squirrel ran along one limb, stopped, and stared down at me like even it knew something had changed. I did not tear the notice. I did not call the number printed under Marjorie Blake's name. I went inside, took 3 photographs of the paper on the door, 3 more after removing it, then laid it flat on the kitchen table beside the letter from the day before. I wrote the date, time, and weather in a notebook Claire used to keep grocery lists in, because some habits from 30 years of environmental work never leave you. When someone starts building a lie, you start building a record. The notice said I had 7 days to submit a tree removal plan. It said failure to comply would result in compounding penalties, legal action, and possible suspension of shared community privileges. That last part almost made me laugh, but the sound never came out. The only shared privilege I had with Cedar View Estates was the privilege of being watched from their windows. Still, the language mattered. People like Marjorie did not write threats by accident. They wrote them to make ordinary people feel already defeated before a judge, a lawyer, or even a neighbor ever got involved. At 9:17, the rumble of a diesel truck rolled down my gravel drive. It came slow, heavy, confident. A white landscaping truck stopped beneath the oak, towing a wood chipper with faded green paint and rust around the bolts. 2 men climbed out in orange safety vests, followed by a younger woman in sunglasses, who never looked at the house, only at the tree. She unfolded a measuring wheel, clicked it against the ground, and began walking a circle around the trunk as if my yard had become a job site while I was still standing in it. I stepped off the porch with the violation notice folded in my back pocket. The larger of the 2 men had a gray beard and hands scarred from real work. He looked uncomfortable as soon as he saw me. The younger woman did not. She pointed at the lower limbs, then toward the lake, then made a clean, horizontal motion with her hand across the air. Not pruning, not trimming, a cut line. The older worker met me halfway across the wet grass. His boots left dark prints in the frost. He asked if I was the owner, and when I said yes, something in his face tightened. He glanced back at the woman with the measuring wheel, then at the truck, then at the oak. He said they had a work order from the HOA for canopy reduction, lake corridor clearance, and hazard mitigation. Those were polished words, office words, words that made a living thing sound like paperwork. I told him there was no work order on my property. The woman in sunglasses finally turned. She was younger than Marjorie, maybe early 30s, with the same sharp chin and the same practiced impatience. Her jacket had a stitched logo over the heart. Blake Landscape and View Restoration. That name told me more than she probably intended. She said they were not removing the tree, only correcting a few branches, but her measuring wheel was already marking the root zone, and one of the men had a can of orange spray paint in his hand. When I asked who authorized them to enter, she held up her phone without offering it to me, as if the glow of an email was enough to override a deed. The older worker looked at the ground. The younger one with the spray paint did not. He marked a bright orange X near the base of the trunk. That was the first time my voice changed. Not loud, not angry, just low enough that all 3 of them stopped moving. I told them to leave my property, and I told the man with the spray paint that if he marked 1 more inch of that tree, I would call the county sheriff, the state forestry office, and every licensing board connected to the name on his truck. The older worker backed up immediately. The woman in sunglasses held my stare for 3 seconds longer than necessary, then smiled the way Marjorie smiled, as if she had found a weakness she could use later. Before she climbed into the truck, she looked past me at the porch, then at the oak, then at the lake shining between its limbs. She said one sentence, almost casually, and it stayed in the air after the engine started. "Trees die all the time, Mr. Walker." The truck backed out slowly, wood chipper rattling behind it like loose bones. I watched until it disappeared up the hill towards Cedarview. Then I walked to the orange X at the base of the oak. The paint was still wet. I crouched beside it, touched nothing, and took photographs from every angle. My hands were steady, but something cold had moved into my chest. A fine was one thing, a letter was one thing. A stranger marking a living tree in my yard was something else entirely. I spent the next 2 hours at the kitchen table with the purchase documents spread out like a battlefield. Deed, survey, parcel map, inspection reports, old county attachments, environmental disclosures. The kind of papers most people skim and sign because they trust that if something mattered, someone would have mentioned it. I had learned a long time ago that the most important sentence in any file is usually the one buried where nobody expects a person to keep reading. The appendix was clipped behind an old shoreline management report, yellowed at the edges, stamped by the state of Oregon 12 years earlier. At first, it looked like nothing more than a vegetation map. Then I saw the small black circle on my parcel, exactly where the oak stood. Beside it was a code number and 4 words that made the room go still around me. State Heritage Tree Corridor. I read the line again, then the paragraph under it. Native white oaks along the Lake Alder shoreline were protected under a state-managed conservation corridor. No removal, major pruning, root disturbance, or intentional damage without review and written approval from the state. I sat back in the chair, listening to the refrigerator hum and the faint sound of wind through the very branches they had marked for cutting. Marjorie Blake thought she was fighting a homeowner over a view. She had no idea she had put her hands on something the state had already claimed an interest in. Near dusk, I found Milo at the small public dock below my property, sitting alone with his knees pulled up and his sketchbook balanced against them. The lake was dark blue by then, with the first house lights trembling across the water. His bicycle lay in the weeds beside him. A group of kids from Cedarview had passed him a few minutes earlier, laughing too loudly, one of them calling him Trash Porch Kid before riding away toward the clean streets above. Milo did not chase them. He did not even look up. He just pressed his pencil harder into the paper until the tip snapped. I walked down the dock slowly and stopped far enough away not to scare him. On the page, he had drawn my oak, but not the way adults see trees. He had drawn it enormous, with the trunk like a tower, and the branches curved protectively over a tiny cabin, a tiny dock, a tiny boy. In his drawing, the tree was not blocking the lake. It was holding the world together. He told me without looking up that Marjorie had put his mother's name in the HOA newsletter again. Past due fees, porch clutter, community conduct warning. He said everyone at school knew by lunch. His voice was flat, like he had learned not to spend emotion on humiliation because there was always more coming. I looked across the water at the reflection of Cedarview Estates, all those bright windows stacked on the hill, and for the first time, I understood that the oak was not the beginning of Marjorie's cruelty. It was just the first piece of it that had touched my land. When I got back to the cabin, the porch was almost dark. The oak moved above me in the night wind, leaves whispering against one another like paper being turned in a room full of people waiting for evidence. I placed the violation notice, the photos of the orange X, the landscaping company name, and the heritage tree appendix into a plain folder. Then I wrote a label across the tab in black marker. Cedar View, Oak File. I just closed the folder when headlights swept across the kitchen wall. A vehicle had stopped at the end of my driveway, not on the road, on my gravel. Its engine stayed running, hidden behind the dark shape of the oak, and through the window, I saw someone step out holding a chainsaw case. The sound came before the sun did. A chainsaw screamed through the dark like metal tearing open the morning, and for one breath, I did not know where I was, only that something living was being hurt outside my window. Then the house shook with a heavy crack, a deep wooden groan rolled across the yard, and every bird in the oak exploded into the gray sky. I was out of bed before I had both boots on. The kitchen clock read 6:11. Dawn had barely touched the lake, just a pale silver line beyond the glass, but my front yard was already full of people, machines, exhaust, and sawdust spinning in the fog like ash. One of the great lower limbs of the oak lay across the grass, thick as a telephone pole, its fresh-cut end bright and raw. Another branch hung half-severed above the porch, leaves trembling in the cold air, dripping dew onto the boards like the tree was bleeding. The white landscaping truck was parked sideways near the driveway, wood chipper running behind it, its orange hazard lights pulsing against the wet bark. Two workers in vests were dragging branches toward the machine. Nora Blake stood near the trunk with a clipboard in one hand and a coffee cup in the other, her sunglasses pushed up into her hair, calm as a surgeon who had already made the incision. At the road, Marjorie Blake held her phone upright, filming everything with a satisfied little smile, while three neighbors watched from the sidewalk in robes and slippers, too stunned or too trained to speak. I stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, and the world sharpened. The smell of cut oak was everywhere, green and sweet and wrong. The orange X from the day before was partly buried beneath a drift of sawdust. A section of bark had been scraped open by a ladder. The metal tag I had noticed in the appendix photo, the small state marker that should have been fixed low on the trunk, was gone. There was only a pale rectangle where it had been, 4 empty screw holes staring back at me. That was when my anger went cold. I took out my phone and started recording. Not the way people record when they are trying to win an argument on the internet. Slowly, carefully. License plate, company logo, truck number, faces, chainsaw, wood chipper, fresh cuts, the severed limb, the missing tag mark, Nora's clipboard, Marjorie's phone, the neighbors. The entire yard, one steady sweep at a time. My hands did not shake. That almost scared me more than if they had. Marjorie saw me filming, and her smile brightened as if she had been waiting for her audience to arrive. She turned slightly toward the neighbors, loud enough for them and my camera to hear, and said that I had finally agreed to cooperate with a reasonable view restoration plan. One of the neighbors looked from her to me and immediately looked away. Another pulled her robe tighter across her chest. Nobody wanted to be the first person to admit the emperor was holding a chainsaw. I walked across the grass toward Nora. Every step crushed leaves and chips beneath my boots. The older worker from the day before saw me coming and shut off his saw without being told. The sudden silence was worse than the noise. The wood chipper kept growling behind him, hungry and waiting. Nora did not move. She glanced at my phone, then at my face, and gave me the same thin smile she had worn when she said trees die all the time. She told me the HOA had authorized emergency corrective trimming for a nuisance tree affecting multiple lakefront properties. She said the work was already approved, already funded, already scheduled, as if the words were a fence she could build around herself fast enough. I asked her whose land she was standing on. The question landed harder than shouting would have. The worker with the saw stared at the ground. The younger man near the chipper stopped pulling branches. Nora's jaw tightened, and for the first time, she looked toward Marjorie instead of at me. Marjorie lowered her phone just a little. Nora repeated that the HOA had authority. I asked again, quieter, "Whose land?" No one answered. The fog lifted another inch off the lake. and sunlight caught the cut face of the fallen limb. It was beautiful in the most unbearable way. Pale rings packed tight together, decade after decade, a calendar of storms, droughts, summers, winters, all opened in one careless morning because someone wanted a cleaner view from a breakfast nook. Then Marjorie made the mistake that would follow her all the way to a hearing room. She lifted her phone again, turned toward the uphill houses, and said that once the tree was gone, the entire back row would have $1 million lake view. She said it like a sales pitch, like a toast, like the tree was already dead and she was standing in the future taking credit for the sunrise. I kept recording. Nora stepped toward me then, close enough that I could see a fleck of sawdust stuck to her cheek. She said the crew would finish the safety cut and leave, and if I interfered, she would document homeowner obstruction. It was such a clean, corporate sentence that for a second I pictured how many times Marjorie must have taught people in Cedarview to fear phrases exactly like that. Document, obstruction, violation, penalty. Words dressed like law, used like a leash. I did not move out of her way. I called the county sheriff first, then the Oregon State Parks Heritage Tree contact listed in the appendix, then one number I had not called in nearly a year. Sam Whitcomb answered on the second ring. I had worked with Sam on shoreline restoration projects back when my life still had schedules and office coffee and Claire waiting at home. He was a state forestry compliance officer now, the kind of man who could walk into a burned hillside and tell you where the fire had lied. I told him 4 sentences. Private parcel, Oregon white oak, Heritage Corridor Appendix, active cutting. His voice changed before I finished. He told me not to touch the wood, not to let them remove anything, and not to let that chipper eat another branch if I could stop it safely. By then, Nora had restarted her confidence. She told the workers to continue. The older man hesitated. The younger one looked toward the chipper, then toward the limb hanging over the porch, then lifted his saw halfway. I stepped between him and the tree, not close enough to be reckless, close enough to make him choose whether he was still doing landscaping or something uglier. The saw dropped back to his side. The worker's face flushed under his hard hat. For a moment nobody moved, and the only sound was the engine of the chipper chewing empty air. Marjorie shouted from the road that I was threatening contractors. A neighbor raised her phone, but kept it low against her robe, recording secretly, ashamed of needing to hide even that. Across the street, near the mailboxes, I saw Milo. He was half hidden behind a cedar hedge, face pale, backpack hanging from one shoulder. He had his own phone in both hands, held tight to his chest like it might burn him. Our eyes met, and the fear on his face was not the fear of a kid caught watching something. It was the fear of a kid who had already seen too much before I ever came outside. Sam arrived 22 minutes later in a state vehicle with mud on the doors and no patience in his face. He was tall, heavy-shouldered, wearing a green field jacket, gray hair cut close, eyes fixed on the tree before he even closed his truck door. The sheriff's deputy pulled in behind him. Marjorie began talking before either of them reached the yard. Sam walked past her as if she were weather. He went straight to the trunk. I watched him crouch where the tag had been removed. He touched the empty screw holes with 2 fingers, then looked at the cut limbs, the orange paint, the dragged branches, the chipper. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When Sam Whitcomb stood up, the whole yard seemed to understand that something had shifted from neighborhood drama into state evidence. He ordered the crew away from the tree. He photographed every cut. He placed orange evidence tape around the fallen limbs and tagged the largest section with a numbered seal. He asked Nora for permits. She showed him the HOA email. He asked for state authorization. She had nothing. He asked who removed the heritage marker. No one spoke. Marjorie's face changed then. Not guilt, calculation. She looked at Nora, then at the crew, then at the neighbors, trying to find the weakest place to push blame. That was when Milo stepped from behind the hedge. Lena appeared a second later, breathless, gripping his shoulder, whispering his name like a warning and a plea. He looked smaller in the open, swallowed by the road, the lake, the adults, the ruined tree. His phone was still in his hand. He did not come to me. He went to Sam. I could not hear the first words, only see the boy unlock the screen with trembling fingers. Sam bent slightly to watch. Lena covered her mouth. Milo's shoulders shook once, hard, but he did not put the phone away. Later, Sam would let me hear the recording. It had been taken before I woke up, from behind the hedge. Nora's voice was clear over the first cough of the chainsaw, impatient and low, telling the worker to cut deep into the collar, not just the limb, because if the tree died slowly, the homeowner would not be able to argue about removal later. In the yard, standing beside the half-destroyed oak, I saw the moment Sam heard that sentence. His eyes lifted from Milo's phone to Nora Blake. And Nora finally stopped smiling. The clubhouse windows were glowing like a warning beacon by the time I reached Cedar View Estates. Every parking space was full, cars lined both sides of the street, and through the glass I could see people packed shoulder to shoulder beneath warm ceiling lights, their faces turned toward a projection screen where my house and my wounded oak filled the wall like evidence in a murder trial. Outside, under the flagpole, Milo stood beside Lena with his hood pulled up, clutching his phone in both hands, as if the whole neighborhood might hear what was trapped inside it. The air smelled like wet pavement, lake wind, and fresh fear. Someone had printed signs and taped them to the clubhouse doors. Emergency community meeting. Protect our property values. Underneath, in smaller letters, someone had added in black marker, Stop the outsider lawsuit. I stopped in front of it for half a second. I had not filed a lawsuit yet. Marjorie had invented one before I could, then invited 96 households to be afraid of it. I carried one thing with me, a plain brown envelope, sealed, unmarked, tucked under my arm. Inside were copies of nothing important. The real documents were at home in the oak file, beside Sam's preliminary report, the photographs, the violation notice, the orange paint, the missing marker evidence, and Milo's video now backed up in 3 places. The envelope was not proof. It was weight. People who live by intimidation understand props better than truth, and I needed Marjorie looking at the envelope more than she looked at me. Inside, the room went quiet in waves. First, the people by the door recognized me, then the back row, then the middle. A few residents turned away as if eye contact might be a violation. Others stared openly, curious, angry, or just exhausted. I saw Arthur Reed near the coffee urn, an old man with suspenders and a cane, watching the room with the resigned face of someone who had seen this pattern repeat for years. I saw the woman who had secretly recorded from her bathrobe the morning of the cutting. I saw the older landscaping worker standing at the far wall, hat in his hands, looking like he wished he had chosen any other job site in Oregon. Marjorie was at the front in a navy blazer, her silver blonde hair perfect, her smile brighter than the lights. Nora sat at the board table beside her, arms folded, jaw tight, the confidence from my yard replaced by something harder and quieter. Behind them, the screen showed an edited photo of my oak before the cut, its broad canopy blocking most of the lake. Across the image, Marjorie had placed 3 red words, View Corridor Obstruction. I took a seat in the last row. Marjorie did not acknowledge me at first. That was part of the theater. She let the room settle, tapped the microphone, thanked everyone for coming to defend the community, then began building her version of the story, one polished sentence at a time. She said Cedar View Estates was under attack from an outside property owner who did not understand the shared responsibility of lakefront living. She said a single, unmanaged tree had reduced property values across an entire row of homes. She said the board had taken reasonable, minimal action to protect the collective good. She did not say chainsaw. She did not say state. She did not say Milo. The slides moved behind her. A photo of my cabin, a photo of the oak, a photo of my truck, a map with my property shaded in red like a contamination zone. Then a table showing projected losses if lake views were permanently obstructed. The numbers were large enough to scare people who measured safety in home equity. 200,000 here, 400,000 there, 1 million across the rear lots. I watched residents lean forward, not because they understood the law, but because fear always sounds smarter when it comes with decimals. Then, Marjorie made her proposal. She asked the community to authorize emergency legal spending from the HOA Reserve Fund to pursue damages against me for interfering with Cedarview's lake view rights. She asked for permission to seek a court order allowing complete removal of the oak. She asked the room to stand behind the board, and her voice trembled at exactly the right moment, as if she were the one whose yard had been invaded before sunrise. A hand rose 2 rows ahead of me. A man asked whether the tree was actually on HOA land. Marjorie smiled at him with pity. She said the issue was not narrow ownership, but community impact. That answer should have bothered everyone. It only bothered a few. I waited. She kept talking, and the longer she talked, the more rope she pulled around herself. She said the HOA had managed lakefront aesthetics for 12 years. She said previous owners had always cooperated. She said Cedarview residents had a right to preserve the views they paid for. Nora stared at the table while her mother spoke, and I wondered if she had finally realized that her sentence on Milo's video was not something a person could dress up in bored language. Then Marjorie looked straight at me. The room followed her gaze. She invited me to explain myself, not kindly, not fairly. She said my name into the microphone like a charge being read aloud. Ethan Walker, the man preventing families from enjoying the lake they had invested their lives in. Ethan Walker, the man threatening a neighborhood over a tree. Ethan Walker, the outsider who wanted to turn neighbor against neighbor. I stood. The chair legs scraped softly against the floor. That small sound felt louder than the microphone. I walked down the center aisle with the envelope under my arm, passing faces that tried not to reveal what they hoped would happen next. At the front, I did not take the microphone right away. I looked at the screen, at my tree frozen in red letters, then at Marjorie, then at the board table where Nora's knuckles had gone white. When I spoke, I kept my voice low enough that people had to listen. I said I had one question for the board, not a speech, not an accusation. One question. Could Marjorie Blake, Nora Blake, or any member of the Cedarview Estates HOA produce a deed, easement, covenant, signed agreement, court order, or recorded document giving the HOA authority to enter my private property and order the cutting of my tree? The silence was immediate and physical. You could hear the refrigerator behind the coffee station. You could hear a child shifting in a chair near the back. You could hear the microphone hum as Marjorie's smile held too long and then began to fail. She looked to the board members on her left. One looked down. Another shuffled papers he already knew were useless. Nora did not look up at all. Marjorie said Cedarview had managed the visual landscape for 12 years. I said management was not ownership. The words landed clean. She said the tree affected the whole community. I said a lake view was not a permit to damage a state-protected oak. That was when the room changed. Not loudly, not all at once. A murmur moved through the residents like wind pushing across dry grass. Someone whispered, "State-protected." Someone else said, "She never told us that." Arthur Reed leaned both hands on his cane and closed his eyes, as if he had been waiting a long time to hear a simple sentence said in public. Marjorie tried to recover. Her voice sharpened. She accused me of twisting facts, of frightening residents, of weaponizing bureaucracy. She said no one cared about some obscure tree designation when families were about to lose value in their homes. The mistake was not the words. It was the contempt underneath them. People can forgive arrogance when it protects them. They start questioning it when it exposes them. I told the room that a state forestry officer had documented the cuts, the removed marker, and the lack of authorization. I told them there would be an initial hearing Thursday morning. I did not mention the video. I did not mention Nora's instruction to cut deep. I did not open the envelope. The truth was stronger when it still had shadows around it. Then Lena stood. She stood so suddenly that Milo reached for her sleeve, but she gently moved his hand away. Her face was pale, her cardigan buttoned wrong, but her voice held. She told the room that Marjorie had threatened to fine her $1,000 if she signed any complaint against the board. She told them her son had been humiliated in the newsletter because she was behind on fees. She told them the board had turned ordinary mistakes into public shame and called it community standards. No one interrupted her. Milo stared at the floor, tears sliding quietly down his face, not from weakness, but from the terrible relief of watching someone finally say the thing everyone knew and no one had been brave enough to say. That was the moment people would argue about later in the comments, if this were a video. Some would say Lena should have spoken sooner. Others would say, no one understands fear until their home, their child, and their debt are all being held over their head by a smiling woman with a gavel. I only knew what I saw. A room full of adults realizing the smallest person in Cedarview had been carrying the heaviest proof. Marjorie slammed the microphone off. The sharp pop made half the room flinch. She declared the meeting closed, though no vote had been taken. Chairs scraped, voices rose. For the first time since I had arrived, the noise in that clubhouse did not belong to her. I turned toward the residents before leaving and said one last thing. I was not there to fight them. I was there because someone had used their hoe like an axe against property that did not belong to her. Outside, the lake was black beneath the hill, and the cut oak waited in the dark below. Milo followed me to the edge of the parking lot, his phone held out in both shaking hands. Lena stood behind him, crying without making a sound. On the screen, frozen in the glow between us, was Nora Blake's face at dawn, and her voice, clear as a confession, said, "Cut deep. If it dies slowly, he won't be able to stop us." The hearing room did not look like a place where lives changed, and that made it more dangerous. No judge's bench, no flag-heavy drama, no polished wooden witness stand, just gray carpet, humming fluorescent lights, a long conference table, and a framed photograph of an old-growth forest on the wall. But when Sam Whitcomb rolled in a steel evidence cart with sealed oak samples, printed maps, and Milo's video drive locked in a plastic bag, every person on Marjorie Blake's side of the table seemed to understand at once that this was no longer a neighborhood argument about a view. Marjorie arrived in a black blazer and pearls, dressed for sympathy. Nora came behind her in a camel coat, sunglasses still on even indoors, her mouth pressed into a hard line. Their HOA attorney looked younger than his briefcase, with the restless hands of a man who had been told one version of a story and had begun doubting it in the parking lot. Two board members sat at the end of the table, stiff and silent, no longer looking at Marjorie for permission before they breathed. Lena sat behind me with Milo beside her, one hand resting on his shoulder. He stared at the floor, hoodie sleeves pulled over his palms, as if the phone in Sam's evidence bag had grown teeth overnight. The state hearing officer, a woman named Helen Pierce, entered with a thin folder and the expression of someone who had spent 20 years watching people underestimate paperwork. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She explained that the state was reviewing potential violations involving a protected Oregon white oak within the Lake Alder Heritage Tree Corridor, possible unauthorized cutting, possible removal of state identification, and potential environmental damage to a protected shoreline resource. The words landed one by one, heavier than anything Marjorie had said in the clubhouse. The HOA attorney started with the safest lie. They did not know. He said the board believed the matter involved routine view maintenance. He said the contractor had been instructed only to trim dead or hazardous branches. He said no one from the HOA had been aware of a heritage designation. As he spoke, Marjorie nodded softly, almost sadly, playing the part of a woman betrayed by confusion. Nora stared at the table. Her left foot tapped once, twice, then stopped when her mother glanced at it. Sam opened the first folder. The overhead screen lit up with the conservation map from my purchase documents. A black circle marked the tree. A corridor line ran along the lakefront, crossing my parcel cleanly. Then came the recorded property boundary, the tax parcel image, and the shoreline report with the same code printed beside the oak. Sam walked the room through it without emotion, the way a surgeon names organs before making the cut. The tree was not common landscaping. It was a registered native oak within a state-managed conservation corridor. Major pruning required review. Root disturbance required review. Removal required written authorization. Intentional damage could be referred for civil penalties and criminal review. The attorney shifted in his chair. Marjorie's nodding stopped. Then Sam showed the photographs from my yard. The cut limb, the orange paint, the scraped bark, the missing metal tag scar, the 4 small screw holes in the trunk. The room felt colder when that image appeared. Even the board members leaned forward. It is one thing to claim ignorance of a designation buried in old papers. It is another to stare at the empty outline of a sign someone had physically removed. The attorney said tags fall off trees all the time. Sam looked at him for a long second, then placed a sealed evidence bag on the table. Inside was the metal tag. I found it 2 nights after the cutting, wedged under blackberry canes near the drainage ditch where someone had thrown it hard enough to bend one corner. The stamped code matched the appendix, the map, and the state registry. Mud still clung to the screw holes. When Sam slid the photograph of the tag onto the screen, a board member whispered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer or a curse. Marjorie leaned toward her lawyer, but he did not lean back. That was the first crack. The second came from Milo. Helen Pierce asked whether the minor wished to submit video evidence through his guardian. Lena's hand tightened on his shoulder. Milo looked as if every adult in the room had turned into a locked door. For a moment, I thought he would refuse, and I would not have blamed him. He was 12 years old. He should have been worried about math homework and whether his bike chain needed oil, not whether a group of grown-ups would punish his mother for telling the truth. Lena bent close to him and whispered something I could not hear. Milo closed his eyes, nodded once, and Sam connected the drive. The video filled the screen, shaky at first, filmed from behind the cedar hedge in the gray-blue light before dawn. The landscaping truck rolled into my driveway. Nora's voice came through thin but clear. She told the worker to cut deep into the collar, not just the limb. She said if the tree died slowly, the homeowner would not be able to stop removal later. Then another voice, Marjorie's, floated in from off-camera, brighter and farther away, saying that once the tree was gone, the whole back row would finally have $1 million lake view. No one moved. Not Marjorie, not Nora, not the attorney, not the board. The video kept playing for a few seconds after the words ended. Just the sound of the chainsaw starting, Milo's frightened breathing behind the phone, and the terrible first bite of metal into wood. Helen Pierce asked for the video to be paused. The screen froze on Nora's face, lit by the truck's hazard lights, one hand raised toward the oak. That was the moment everyone in that room wanted to comment, even if no one did. Because the lie had not been complicated. It had not been a misunderstanding. It had been ordinary greed spoken out loud before the sun came up, caught by a child they had spent months teaching not to matter. Nora finally removed her sunglasses. Her eyes were wet, but not with remorse. Panic has its own shine. The attorney tried to shift blame to the contractor. He said Nora's wording was unfortunate, not intentional. He said the HOA relied on professional judgment. Sam responded by opening the contractor records. Blake Landscape and View Restoration had no state authorization to work on protected heritage trees. No arborist approval, no shoreline disturbance permit, no environmental review. Then Sam opened the payment history the board members had produced after the clubhouse meeting. Year after year, HOA checks had gone to Nora's company for view maintenance, corridor enhancement, and aesthetic compliance, all without competitive bids. One board member pushed his chair back slightly, as if distance could save him. The hidden truth came out almost quietly. Nora had 3 listing agreements prepared for homes in the back row of Cedarview Estates. All 3 descriptions mentioned potential expanded lake views pending landscape correction, higher listing prices, higher commissions, a private financial interest dressed up as community benefit. Marjorie had not just been protecting property values. She had been protecting her daughter's sales pitch with HOA money. Lena let out a breath behind me that sounded like something breaking open. The attorney asked for a recess. Helen Pierce denied it. She issued the preliminary findings in a voice flat enough to be merciless. The state would assess penalties against the HOA and Blake Landscape and View Restoration for unauthorized damage to a protected tree. The company's activities around the corridor would be suspended pending review. The matter of the removed identification tag and intentional damage would be referred to the county prosecutor. The HOA would be required to fund a full ecological assessment, stabilization plan, and long-term restoration under state supervision. Marjorie stood before the officer finished. For the first time since I had met her, she looked less like a president than a woman who had walked too far onto thin ice and heard it crack beneath both feet. She said the residents would suffer if the HOA was fined. She said families could lose savings. She said this was one tree blocking one view, one tree standing in the way of a community's future. Helen Pierce looked at the frozen image of the oak on the screen, then back at Marjorie. She said the future did not belong only to people with windows. That sentence moved through the room like weather. After the hearing, the hallway outside filled with low voices and avoided eyes. The 2 board members stepped away from Marjorie and began talking to each other in harsh whispers. Nora walked to the restroom with one hand over her mouth. The attorney stood by the vending machine, already on the phone, probably calling someone older and more expensive. Milo stayed near the wall, shoulders hunched, waiting for punishment that did not come. Instead, Arthur Reed approached him slowly, took off his cap, and told him that what he did was braver than anything he had seen from the board in 12 years. Milo looked up, startled, and for 1 second, he looked exactly like a kid again. Then a woman from Cedarview crossed the hallway and hugged Lena. Then another. Then the man who had asked about property ownership at the clubhouse came over and said he had records from the HOA portal showing payments to Nora's company. Someone else said there were no bids. Someone else said Marjorie had used reserve funds without a vote. The fear that had kept them separate began turning into something louder, messier, and far more dangerous to her than anger. Witnesses. Sam stepped beside me at the window overlooking the parking lot. Outside, Marjorie stood alone beside her SUV, phone pressed to her ear, her reflection broken across the glass. He told me the tree might not survive the collar damage. He said they could stabilize it, protect what remained, maybe give it a chance, but the wound was deep. I looked at the lake beyond the parking lot, bright under a cold sky, and felt the victory go hollow. Then my phone buzzed. A new email had arrived from the Cedarview HOA, sent to all residents and copied to me by mistake or arrogance. The subject line read, "Emergency Assessment Notice." The first sentence blamed me for all pending state penalties, legal costs, and restoration expenses. The second sentence announced that any resident cooperating with my complaint would be fined for conduct harmful to the association. But the attachment at the bottom was worse. It was a civil complaint drafted against Lena Ortiz for defamation, harassment, and conspiracy. Milo had told the truth, and Marjorie had decided to punish his mother for it. The recall vote happened on a rain-heavy Tuesday night, and by the time it was over, Marjorie Blake was sitting alone in the front row of the clubhouse, while 71 paper ballots lay stacked against her name. No applause came at first, just the sound of folding chairs scraping, people breathing again, and one woman near the back whispering that she had forgotten what the room sounded like without fear in it. Marjorie did not cry. That would have required surrender. She sat upright in the same navy blazer she had worn to the hearing, pearls shining under the fluorescent lights, hands folded so tightly in her lap that her knuckles looked carved from bone. Nora was not there. Her company license had been suspended in the county 2 weeks earlier, and the settlement papers had already named her personally for the unauthorized cutting, the destroyed tag, and the years of HOA money that had flowed into her business without bids, without votes, without shame. When the interim secretary read the final count aloud, Marjorie only turned her head toward Lena Ortiz, who stood near the aisle with Milo beside her, and gave her a look sharp enough to remind everyone that losing power is not the same as losing bitterness. But Lena did not look away. That was the moment the room changed for good. The months after the hearing did not feel like victory. They felt like cleanup after a storm. State penalties came first, then restoration orders, then the civil settlement. The HOA was forced to pay for the ecological assessment, compensate me for property damage, refund years of improper fines to residents, and amend its bylaws so no board president could ever again turn personal preference into neighborhood law. Marjorie's emergency complaint against Lena collapsed before it reached a courtroom. The attorney who had drafted it withdrew within days of seeing Milo's video and the state referral. A letter arrived later, full of careful phrases and no apology, saying the matter would not proceed. Lena read it on my porch with both hands shaking, then folded it once and laughed so suddenly that Milo started crying. The oak did not recover the way people hoped it would. Sam came out every few weeks with measuring tape, soil probes, and that quiet field patience of his. He wrapped the wounds, checked the crown, marked new stress cracks in the bark, and stood under the damaged limbs for long stretches without speaking. By late summer, half the canopy had browned. The branches Marjorie wanted gone were gone, but not cleanly, not mercifully. They had been torn from the tree's future. Woodpeckers began landing on the dead side. Beetles found the exposed grain. The tree was still standing, but some living things survive only by becoming partly memorial. The day Sam finally told me the truth, the lake was bright enough to hurt. He stood beside the trunk with one hand against the bark, looking up into the broken crown. He said we could preserve the main stem as a wildlife snag, stabilize it, make it safe, let it become shelter for birds, insects, and whatever small creatures needed a hollow place to live. He said it gently, but I heard the sentence underneath. The tree Claire had loved would never again be the tree Claire had touched. I walked to the porch and sat on the top step. For a while, I could not look at anyone. Not Sam, not Lena, not Milo, not the neighbors who had begun gathering at the edge of the yard with shovels, gloves, and uncertain faces. They had come because a new interim board had voted to restore the shoreline with native trees, and the first planting was happening here, beside the wounded oak. They had come because the settlement had created a small fund at my request, the Alder Oak Fund, to plant native trees around the lake and help residents fight abusive fines. They had come because fear had finally become embarrassing, and kindness had become contagious. But grief does not care how many people show up with good intentions. I could still see Claire under that tree, palm against the bark, smiling at something older than both of us. I could still hear Marjorie's voice at dawn, talking about million-dollar views, while sawdust turned the grass pale. I could still see Milo's face in the hearing room when his video froze on Nora's confession. I had won money, documents, rulings, signatures, and apologies written by lawyers. But none of those things could reattach a limb. None of them could put 180 years back into the wood. Lena sat beside me without asking. She did that now. She no longer approached doors like she expected to be punished for knocking. Her hair was tied back, rain jacket muddy at the sleeves, and there was dirt on one cheek where she had wiped sweat with her wrist. The neighborhood had nominated her to the new board 2 weeks after Marjorie's removal. She had refused at first, then accepted when Arthur Reed told her that people who hated power were sometimes the safest ones to hold it. She did not want the title. That was why people trusted her with it. Milo stood near the young sapling, waiting in its burlap root ball. It was an Oregon white oak, barely taller than him, thin and stubborn-looking, its small leaves trembling in the lake wind. He had spent the morning guarding it like a witness. In his hands was a little wooden sign he had sanded himself, the letters burned into the surface with Arthur's old tool. He would not let anyone see it until the tree was planted. The misunderstanding that had haunted the neighborhood finally surfaced that afternoon. One of the back row homeowners, a man named Peter Lang, came down the hill carrying a shovel, his face red with shame before he even spoke. He had been one of the loudest voices at the first clubhouse meeting. He had believed Marjorie when she said I wanted to destroy their property values. He had told people I was trying to bankrupt them. Now he stood in my yard, looking at the ruined oak, and admitted that Marjorie had promised the back row owners their homes could gain 6 figures if the view opened. She had made it sound like the tree was already scheduled for removal, like I had agreed, like only sentimental obstruction remained. He said he had wanted the view. Then he looked at Milo and said he had not wanted this. That was the comment moment, the kind people would fight over. Was an apology enough when silence helped sharpen the saw? Could fear excuse greed? Could ordinary people claim innocence after cheering for something they never had to watch up close? I did not know. I only knew Peter had brought a shovel, and sometimes the first honest thing a person does is smaller than the harm they helped cause. So I handed him a pair of gloves. We planted the sapling at the edge of the old oak's shadow. Sam guided the depth. Arthur held the trunk straight. Lena packed soil around the roots. Milo poured the first bucket of water, slow and careful, his face tight with concentration. Neighbors formed a loose half-circle, quiet in the kind of way people are quiet at funerals and beginnings. The lake shone behind them, still visible, still beautiful, but no longer the only thing worth seeing. When the hole was filled and the soil tamped down, Milo stepped forward with the sign. He pushed the cedar stake into the ground beside the young tree. The letters were uneven, darker in some places where his hand had held the burning tool too long, but they were clear. Protected. Not because it blocks the view, but because it belongs here. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Lena put her hand over her mouth. Arthur removed his cap. Sam looked away toward the lake, pretending to check the shoreline. I stood there with mud on my boots and felt something inside me shift. Not heal exactly, but loosen. The old oak was still wounded. Claire was still gone. Marjorie had still done what she did. But the yard no longer felt like the scene of a crime. It felt like a place where people had finally decided what kind of witnesses they wanted to be. A month later, Marjorie's house went up for sale. No one in Cedarview stopped to stare openly, but everyone noticed. The sign stood in her perfect lawn through rain, sun, and 3 price reductions. Nora moved first, then Marjorie, leaving behind a clubhouse closet full of unused violation stickers and a locked file cabinet. The new board opened in front of 2 witnesses. Inside were years of complaints, unpaid contractor records, and a folder labeled Ortiz, thicker than some tax returns. Lena did not cry when she saw it. She simply closed the folder and asked for copies for every resident who had been fined in secret. By winter, the neighborhood looked different in small ways. Bikes leaned on porches, mailboxes appeared in colors Marjorie would have hated. A wheelchair ramp went up on Maple Court without a single anonymous complaint. The HOA meetings grew boring, which Arthur insisted was the highest form of democracy. The Alder Oak Fund planted 23 native trees before the first frost, and every one of them came with a little metal tag, properly registered, properly recorded, impossible to quietly erase. On the north side of my porch, I hung the bent heritage tag from the old oak in a simple frame, not because I wanted to remember the damage, but because I wanted to remember the moment the damage stopped being private. Beside it, I kept Claire's photograph from the day we first saw the cabin. She was standing under the oak, one hand on the bark, smiling like she had already heard the leaves say welcome. Some evenings, Milo still came down to the dock with his sketchbook. He drew the old oak as a tall, broken guardian full of birds. He drew the new oak as a child with roots like lightning. And sometimes he drew the whole neighborhood from above, the lake blue and wide, the houses small, the trees larger than everything. The last time he showed me one, I asked why he always made the trees so big. He looked at the young oak, then at the old one where a woodpecker had begun tapping into the dead side like a tiny heartbeat. Because they were here before everybody started arguing, he said. I looked across Lake Alder as the sun dropped behind Cedar View Estates, turning every window gold. For the first time since I moved in, the view did not feel stolen, threatened, or priced. It felt shared. The old oak stood wounded but useful. The new oak leaned into the wind, and between them, in the fading light, was the quiet proof that some things do not have to block a view to change what people see. The lesson is simple. Not every fight needs anger. Sometimes patience, truth, and courage are enough to stop someone who abuses power. That oak was more than a tree. It stood for memory, home, and the right to protect what belongs where it is. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs strength today. Comment below. Have you ever seen someone misuse power and think they could get away with it? Subscribe for more stories like this. Thank you for watching, and may God bless you and your family.